takes pleasure in attracting a stellar list of speakers that address today's most relevant issues. The club's place as a refuge for rich discussion and networking has never wavered after 123 seasons.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Restuel, and I'm a director of Canadian Club Toronto. I want to acknowledge that although we are meeting virtually today, Canadian Club Toronto sits in the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I do also want to take a moment to recognize that today is Orange Shirt Day. September 30th marks the day when Indigenous children and youth were removed from their families and communities and placed in residential schools. Today, thousands of citizens across Canada are wearing orange to honor these experiences and to come together in the spirit of truth and reconciliation and hope for Indigenous children and youth today, tomorrow, and in the years to come. Thank you for tuning in for today's discussion. What gets financed gets built is central to understanding how the financial sector can advance the low carbon transition. Today, we've partnered with the Institute for Sustainable Finance for a discussion on financing Canada's climate-smart economy. Before we dive into today's topic, here's some information about how to participate with us. The click here to switch stream button helps if you find that your internet is slow. The video quality may decrease, but the audio quality should remain strong. Once you click the questions tab, you can enter your question in the window and they will be sent to the moderator. The request help button, located in the bottom right corner of the page, is for technical support. Most importantly, thank you for today's event sponsor, Queen's University. Thanks to their generous support, today's event was free of charge to all attendees. We are very grateful for the support of Queen's University for this important conversation. Now to introduce today's panelists. We have Martha Hall Findlay, the Chief Sustainability Officer for Suncor Energy. Ryan Riordan, the Director of Research at the Institute for Sustainable Finance. Craig Stewart, Vice President, Federal Affairs for the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And Carlyle Coutinho, President of Enwave North America. Today's panel will be moderated by Shawn McCarthy, General Counsel for Sussex Strategy Group, and a former global energy reporter with the Globe and Mail. One of the club's traditions that has not changed in this virtual world is the toast we make to our country. Usually done in person with the raising of a glass, let's make a nod towards the screen and toast Canada. To Canada. Shawn, I'll turn the Canadian Club podium over to you.
Thanks very much, Karen. Cheers to Canada. Ryan, you're going to kick us off with a bit of a review of the recent paper that you presented. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Shawn, for the kind words. Thank you, Karen, as well, for leading us in. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the importance of sustainable finance, a little bit about the Institute for Sustainable Finance, and some of the key findings, and hopefully to start a conversation about how we transition to a low carbon future. So thank you to the Canadian Club for this opportunity. Thanks to everyone, I'm supposed to say joining in, but really we're all Zooming in today. I want to walk you through why I think that this is important and this is a discussion that we should be having. First, I think I should define what sustainable finance is, since we'll be talking about it a lot today. And sustainable finance is the recognition, consideration, and the incorporation of environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment or the investment management process. It's also about the realization, and for me this is certainly true, that the environment is an important input into our economic system. We can't continue to behave as if the environment is, or the atmosphere, is an inexhaustible resource. And so we need to align capital flows to reflect this fact. And I use the example of Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, in which the environment is the slave to economics until it's too late. And sustainable finance is about recognizing that achieving sustainability in finance or in the economy and sustainability in the environment are two sides of the same coin. So who are we? We've mentioned it already. The Institute of Sustainable Finance is a research organization. We're housed at the Smith School of Business at Queen's University. It is the first Canadian and one of the first global collaborative hubs for academics like myself, but also members of the private sector and government, and to focus our attention on Canada's sustainable finance and building that capacity in the country. So not only through writing reports like this, but also educating the next and current generation of leaders of business. So our goal is to fill the gap with relevant data and expertise and business-oriented solutions. We really want to help support the transition that we have to undergo in Canada. And we do this also by fostering Canada's leadership and making sure that we're at the forefront of these changes. So as was mentioned at the start, an old adage is that what gets financed gets built. And this is certainly true in the sustainability field. And so what we wanted to do, and the reason we released this report, is that we wanted to say, well, if what gets financed gets built, how do we figure out what needs to get financed, and how do we align the capital that we need to with the projects that we need to get done? So yesterday we released our research report. It's a concrete, data-driven capital blueprint for Canada's low-carbon transition. And what this means is we let the evidence speak for us. I didn't go in with a particular bent. We went in to say, well, how much is this going to cost? What kind of assumptions do we need to make to figure out how much it's going to cost? And we let the numbers speak for themselves. So we used Canada's 2030 climate target as our benchmark. And then we tackled this big question: is how do we finance this transition to sort of align our growth or the path over the next 10 years with a low carbon future? We outline investment requirements and opportunities. And this is really the first effort to close this knowledge gap. And so when I originally committed to writing this report, I thought that I would look across the industrialized world. We're certainly not the only country that's committed to the Paris Accord. And I thought I would find multiple reports that I could use as a blueprint. And in fact, I didn't really find very many. This was a difficult question to tackle, which is important now because this means that in Canada, we're one of the first globally to have a clear, concrete, data-driven, evidence-based report on how we attain the goals of our climate accord. This is the first in a series of research. And in this report, we focus on describing what. So what are the investments needed? What's the cost of inaction? And what opportunities exist? The next pieces in this series are going to focus on how to get us there and how to get us there faster, cheaper, and better. Now, I don't want to go into too many assumptions. I know I'm an academic, so I could probably talk for an hour about assumptions, and not everyone's going to want to hear that. But some of the key assumptions that we make is we make the assumption that sectors are going to reduce carbon proportional to what they emit. Two, costs will neither increase or decrease, and we're going to talk about this in the discussion, but there are two schools of thought on this, and we can discuss sort of the school of thought that thinks that costs are going to increase and the school of thought that suggests that costs are going to decrease. And we also assume that carbon reduction will happen in equal steps. That means that this year we'll tackle 3%, next year we'll tackle an additional 3% until we reach our 30% or even more. And I think this is both realistic and economically prudent. Waiting until 2029 is going to make it worse in terms of the economic impact and more chaotic. So in a nutshell, what gets financed gets built is at the heart of the financial sector, and this is what's going to make us more competitive and climate smart. Now, the good news is that the investment we have to make is reasonable and achievable. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And private capital is already flowing in this direction. Just an example of this is Citibank, which recently announced a 5-year, $250 billion fund for climate solutions to reduce climate risk. And there are multiple other examples in Canada, but also globally. And so transitioning to a low carbon economy is necessary if we want to avoid these increasing costs of inaction and missing out on all of the opportunities. Climate change was also a major priority in last week's throne speech. We heard it multiple times. And importantly, the threats and the impact from COVID to our economy, our health, and the overall well-being of Canada's should be our primary focus. But we don't have to think of this as an entirely separate challenge from climate change. We have the opportunity to align our short-term goals of stimulating our battered economy with the long-term goals of having an economy that's the one that we're going to want to have in the future. So investing in reducing emissions isn't the same as fixing a broken window or throwing sort of money out the window. Investing in reducing emissions is about building better roads, bridges, schools, and businesses, investing in electric vehicles and new technologies. Examples like retrofitting buildings that create jobs, training opportunities and investments, and supporting technological innovations in the oil and gas sector are meaningful ways we can build economic and climate resilience. And so now this ambition to meet and to exceed our 2030 climate goals are sort of how we frame this report. But let me get into a little bit of the details, and I'll try to be brief. So the punchline for me is that this is doable. And I say that as a fiscal hawk. And by fiscal hawk, I mean that I think that capital should flow to its most productive use. And so we require an investment over the next 10 years of, we estimate, $120 billion to reduce carbon emissions by 30% by 2030. This means that we need to mobilize roughly $12.8 billion annually. Now, this sounds like a large number, and it is a large number. But if we take a look at in the context of the entire Canadian economy, it makes up roughly 0.6 of Canada's 2018 GDP. It makes up 2.7% of annual provincial tax revenues. And tackling this isn't purely the role of the public or government. This is also a private issue. And we find that we could take less than 10% of the annual capital expenditures of firms that are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, so our large public firms, and we would already be able to tackle this. So we might not even need any new money. We might just need to find good ways to allocate the existing investment that we have in the economy towards these goals. Another way to think about this is that the costs of not investing are exceedingly high. So one estimate from the Economist Intelligence Unit calculated that a 5-degree warming scenario, and that's the current business as usual estimate for what we should expect for warming, could result in losses of $18.4 trillion globally. Now, there are a lot of assumptions that go into that, and we're not going to talk about those, but that's just one estimate that should make it clear that not investing is an extremely expensive endeavor. Now, when we break it down by individual sector, things become, I think, a little bit clearer, and we know where we need to allocate capital. So in this report, we break it down by individual sectors. I won't go over all of them: oil and gas, transportation, buildings. I do talk about 3 key insights. the main takeaway is that not only is this doable, but the private sector has a relatively large role to play. Now, if the traded public firms devote only 5%, in the previous slide we talk about 10%, but if they devoted just 5% of their annual capital expenditure to reducing emissions, that would already cover half of the investment that we need to meet our goals. Just last week, we saw a new public-private partnership announced between Ford with the Ontario and Canada government for a $500 million investment to upgrade a plant to build electric vehicles. So this is already happening. Public funds and private funds are already flowing towards the solutions that we need to get there. Now, let me just talk briefly about Canada's building sector. And I'm going to talk about three, I think, opportunities or key messages that came to me when we were writing the report and we were putting it together. Canada's building sector is what we call our low-hanging fruit. It's our third highest source of emissions, and we know we live in Canada. It's a hot summer and it's a cold winter, so getting buildings right is imperative. And this is the only sector where it's in fact cheaper to abate or reduce carbon emissions than it is to maintain them. So I like to use the analogy of wrapping my house in a jacket. Well, it's cheaper to buy a jacket than it is to pump the heat out the windows. Transportation is, in a country as wide and diverse as Canada, an extremely important, and we call it our highest stakes play. This has the highest cost to abate per sector, and in fact, the highest total abatement costs. But it's something that we need to get right because it has a lot of locked-in capital. The transportation investment decisions that we make today have repercussions not only tomorrow, but 10 or 20 years from now. Think about the investment decisions in Toronto subway in the 1920s. Well, we still live with these decisions today. Now, public and private partnerships can also, in this area, be an effective way to mobilize capital. And finally, no discussion of meeting Canada's climate obligations would be complete if we didn't talk about electricity and oil and gas. And we need to get this right? If we don't get the mixture of energy right in the country, it's going to be really difficult to move forward. So finding a way to balance the low carbon generation of hydroelectricity and oil and gas is something that we're going to need to, I think, power the future of the country. And this is something we'll be talking about on the panel. So what's our opportunity? Well, we've already talked a little bit about the opportunities in the private sector and how capital is flowing. We can take the examples of Shell and BP partnering with Microsoft to achieve net zero emissions, the growth of innovative technologies from the west of Canada, including in Alberta, with companies focusing on a hydrogen economy. And we have a real opportunity for exporting made in Canada reducing technologies to other resource-intensive jurisdictions. We're not the only jurisdiction in the world that's grappling with these issues, but we can be a jurisdiction that grapples with them and then exports these opportunities, and this becomes a comparative advantage. And we have to get this right as a country. It's not just an Alberta or a Saskatchewan province. No province can do it and can do it alone. And I think importantly that Canada has the opportunity to be a lighthouse for other countries. Our geography, our economy is a microcosm of the entire world. We have heat, we have cold, we have mountains, we have rivers, coasts, we have a diverse economy. If we can find ways to tackle this challenge, we can be economic leaders, not only within the country, but across the rest of the world. And so finally, if you want to learn more about the report and I've sort of whet your appetite, please visit our website if you'd like to learn more. You'll also hear about our upcoming Sustainable Finance Conference. And the Sustainable Finance Network is a group of researchers from coast to coast in Canada that are focused on understanding sustainable finance. And we've managed to land Mark Carney as our keynote speaker there. So tune in for more. But with that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone, and let's start a discussion. And sorry for going over time. I'm a professor, so I like to talk.
All right, Ryan. Thanks very much. It was very interesting and really a good setup for the discussion that we're going to have now. And as you mentioned, your reports, there will be a series of reports where you'll delve more deeply into the how, but we're going to get into that. We're going to anticipate that a little bit coming up. Just one observation as we launch into the discussion part. You talk about the fact that the paper is based on the 2030 targets, where you have to have something to measure, but the government has already indicated that it wants to go well beyond, deeper, not just beyond 2030, but deeper by the time we get to 2030. So presumably deeper is going to cost more. And maybe to kick it off, we can get into that low-hanging fruit versus every gigaton of megaton of GHG emission as you go deeper and deeper is more costly. So what does that curve look like as you try to do more 10 years out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would answer the first part of that question and say that, well, before we commit to abating more than 30% by 2030, we should start by abating the first 3% this year. And that was sort of the message of the report. If we start with small, manageable chunks, it's easier for the investment process, it's easier economically, and I think it's easier to tackle. So if we do want to abate more by 2030, maybe we should say, well, let's abate 3.5% a year. But I think the important thing is let's focus on chunks that are doable now and things that we can do now and mobilizing capital now. And I could get into the assumptions of sort of the, are costs going to increase or are costs going to decrease? But maybe I'll let someone else comment on that question.
Good. Well, we have a private sector group of private sector executives here who will be very much in the world of how to deploy capital and how to generate that investment. So Martha, let's start with you, I guess, from the West and the oil and gas industry. Tough times for the sector. Oil prices, gas prices are both low. Access to market is difficult. How do you generate investment for new technology and emission reduction technology in that scenario?
Well, therein lies the question, Shawn. And just for your listeners, Suncor is Canada's leading integrated energy company. So we pull oil out of the ground, but we upgrade, we refine here and in the United States. We have offshore East Coast and as well as in Norway. And then we also have our full retail operation through Petro-Canada. So we know fuels, we know biofuels, we're invested in that. Love to talk about that later, but just to lay the context of who we are also, for anybody who doesn't know, an oil sands company. So we are a very big part of the greenhouse gas emission challenge. COVID has been particularly challenging for us. So we've invested in a variety of companies, Enertech, LanzaTech, LanzaJet, specifically on the fuels. But one of the things that we were investing, big capital project that was on our books, had already been set up to start, was our cogeneration replacement of our coke-fired boilers. Huge reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions because of the need to create steam. But that cogen plant would also have provided an additional 800 megawatts to the Alberta grid, which would then also have helped reduce Alberta's greenhouse gas emissions. So a great project, definitely economically viable in the old world. That was 7 months ago. Because of COVID, we've all had to dramatically cut our CapEx. And the cogeneration is one that has now had to be postponed, as well as our 40-mile wind. We already have some wind, but we were actually going to be doing what was called another wind project that we refer to as 40-mile wind. Both of those have now had to be postponed because fundamentally you can't invest in things unless there is some kind of a return. And so this is going to be a really fascinating discussion and by the way, Ryan, I love the report. Really interesting challenges for us as a society. How do we find the returns that will allow that investment to happen. Because whether it's green or not green in terms of investment, whether it's sustainable or not, investors still need a financial return. So finding that balance that this Ford announcement is really, really interesting, because we're very much looking at, as a company that has had to cut CapEx, as a company that's very keen to invest in these things that can reduce our and other greenhouse gas emissions, some of it might be just timing of finance, right? Because we have a balance sheet challenge. Some of it might be, are there opportunities for government to engage on a temporary basis and then pull out, just so that we can at least get projects done. The other thing that I would say is really interesting for us is, when investors are looking for returns, companies that are looking at some of these new technologies need customers. And there is an opportunity for Suncor, as a very big Canadian company, which spends a lot of money on procurement, as a potential customer for some of these new technologies. The government is now talking about hydrogen, the federal government in particular. The federal government is now talking also about small modular nuclear. Well, we produce a lot of hydrogen. We could really use some technology that reduces our emissions in our oil extraction processes. So there's some really interesting things, but it is going to require collaboration and co-investment and engagement. If anything COVID taught us, is we're going to have to collaborate and cooperate and work on some of these together.
Good. Carlyle, I think Ryan mentioned that buildings in particular was one area where investments in greater efficiency actually do generate those returns that Martha's talking about. Enwave, it's not specifically that, but I think you're in an industry. Tell us a little bit about Enwave and what kind of returns and what the challenges you face in terms of attracting investment into technology that definitely reduces emissions. And does so by often saving energy costs at the same time.
Sure, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and just a little bit about Enwave. So we operate in the district energy space. For those of you that don't know what district energy is, we effectively aggregate load of a whole lot of buildings. For example, in Toronto, we have over 180 buildings that we provide heating and cooling to. We aggregate that load, and we're a supplier from the generation distribution. We store energy and effectively supply. So we're like the electrical grid, but we're the thermal grid equivalent for that. What allows us to be able to do this effectively is scale, and what we can do and bring different than what a building can do on their own is different technologies. So in Toronto, we have deep lake water cooling, many of you may be aware of, where we displace electricity generation by going into the lake and bringing very cold water to air condition downtown Toronto. What that also does is, having the customer base and the scale that we have, we aggregate all the energy from those buildings, so the heating energy, into our loop, and we're able to recycle that to be able to provide useful heating as well. So we look at different technologies, whether it be deep lake water cooling, energy from waste, energy from sewage, recycling energy, to be able to provide a more resilient and more low carbon, but also a very cost competitive service. So we sign every customer up to a unique contract that is negotiated with the customer, and it meets a commercially competitive test. So I think those are all sort of important aspects to our business that are important for people to understand here, because as we work through this whole framework of the future and carbon and abatement, we're really looking to create models that are cost competitive, that are financially viable and long-term in nature. That in the beginning we do 100% agree that it's really important, as we create these models, to get support, to get partnership, to get collaboration. We need to leverage the scale of different organizations, like what Martha was talking about, is that we don't have scale in everything we do. We have scale in what we do, and where there's other areas that are required, we partner up with the right organizations to bring that scale, so that we can provide a better solution and a scalable solution to create greater impact. I think Ryan started off by talking about 3% per year to get to the 30%, and I think I don't know, in theory that all makes sense, but obviously as we go, we'll see how things work out. But what we do know is that as you actually take action, as you invest, momentum, tends to be created, and more investment comes after good investment, and you're going to see, that sort of domino effect that happens. And hopefully, it's not a 3% per year. Hopefully, it starts at 3 and ends up being a 5% and 7% and 10% thereafter. I might be acting as an idealist, but as a organization that's investing heavily into new different business models, I'd like to think that scale is going to be something that is going to allow for greater adoption of technology. One of the areas we're very focused on is the single-family home network for district energy and geothermal geo-exchange, which we're kicking off a project in Ontario around that, and we're seeking partnership, and we are with the municipality, with a major developer in Mattamy, with Enercare, who's also looks at how to manage the home call centers, distribution, techs, and things like that, to be able to create a model that we can scale, hopefully, really quickly across Ontario as we continue to build out. One of the things that we mentioned that was mentioned about the TTC, and once you put infrastructure in place, it tends to define the way we do things. And we're looking at a point in time and taking the responsibility to redefine how we do things, to make the right decisions now, and to be able to have the desired outcomes 30 years from now.
So across your platform, so what kind of return on investment do you see in various, and I'm sure it varies greatly depending on the project, but does everything have to have a what would be considered in this field a commercial rate of investment?
For our organization, I think that's the responsible thing for us to do for our shareholders and stakeholders. And what it does, Shawn, is that it pushes us to actually innovate as much as possible. If we had a lower return requirement, sometimes I think you take an easier route to get there. For us, we really have to push very hard, push our supply chain, gain scale, use our scale to the best that we can to be able to generate the returns that are required to make it a commercially competitive environment that, again, if it's commercially competitive, it stands on its own, you're going to be able to replicate it, hopefully, and continue to grow off of it. So I think those are the things that actually drive us really, really hard. And we've been quite successful at, given the growth that we've had in Ontario across North America.
Very good. Craig, from the insurance industry's perspective, the insurers play a couple of interesting roles here. In the one case, you're looking very much at the impacts of climate change and what it's going to cost the insurance industry to deal with rising claims. On the other, you're very much involved in financial markets, capital markets, as companies. So how do you see this call for getting more investment and driving not just public investment but private sector investment into abatement?
So a little bit about Insurance Bureau of Canada. So just by way of background, we represent property and casualty insurers. So those are your car, home, and business insurers, names such as Intact, Aviva, TD Insurance, Economical Travelers, but also the global reinsurers like Munich Re and Swiss Re. And so globally, we're an industry that's under pressure. We are under pressure because of increasing claims around the world. Not from pandemic, because we don't underwrite pandemic for the most part, not from earthquakes, because they're fairly static, but from severe weather events. By and large, it's severe weather events, particularly those involving wind and water, that are causing losses for our industry. So just so that you understand how the insurance industry works, when you pay premiums, whether you're a business, it's commercial insurance, or whether it's a home or car insurance, insurers actually bundle that risk up. and then pass that risk on to reinsurers. So global reinsurers backstop a lot of our risk. And so Canada as a country is becoming a riskier and riskier place to do business. So you've probably heard the numbers from us. You know, our average payout per year was $400 million a year back in the 1990s. Our average payout to date this year is $2 billion in Alberta alone for severe weather losses in Alberta. One event, a hailstorm, cost us about $1.2 billion back in June. So Canada is becoming a riskier and riskier place. How does that translate? The conversation that typically we have in this country is, what is the cost of abatement? You know, and how are we going to get to those 2030 targets? But there's a cost of inaction. What if we don't do that? How, you know, we can complain about how much it's costing insurance companies, but what does that mean for all of you? Well, we're under a reset right now. Basically, because our reinsurance prices, the premiums we pay to reinsurers, are going up because they are seeing Canada as a pricier, riskier place to do business. Because they're going up, we are pricing risk in turn that gets passed down to the consumer. So we are under a fairly significant reset. We call it a hardening of the market, particularly in the commercial space, whereby every business that operates in the country, most home and vehicle customers are paying more. And why are you paying more? You're paying more because of these severe weather events that we're incurring. So there's both a contraction in the industry with regards to the availability of insurance, the availability of product. There's a rationalization going on, and there is there's an escalation in pricing. So the cost of inaction translates to the cost of delay. This is escalating. The longer we wait, obviously, the higher the risk is going to be. The Fort McMurray fire cost Munich Re $10 billion, which was 10 years of profits in the country, one event. So it's not a surprise. And there are going to be more, as we've seen in California. We're going to see this escalating risk. So we're paying for it today. We're paying it. Everybody's paying for it today. It just isn't. We just aren't aggregating it. And the longer we wait the longer we delay, we're going to lose out both on a competitive aspect. We're going to be paying more in terms of risk, pricing risk, and it's going to be harder to reach those targets on an annual basis. So essentially, there's a pinch that we're feeling now, but we're in a way a frog boiling slowly in hot water. We're not realizing, and we're not connecting the dots sufficiently to realize how much this is actually costing us.
So Ryan, let me bring you in with this idea, and you mentioned the low-hanging fruit, and to extend the metaphor, if you want, you can go out and pick the peaches off the tree standing under the tree, or pick them up off the ground, and then to get the next layer, you have to bring in a ladder, and then they get maybe the crown, the peaches way up at the top. You have to bring in a lift, and that just gets more and more expensive. And I think that's what abatement looks like to some degree. So the flip side of that is that many people believe that the cost of technology is coming down, as you alluded to. So how do those balance out? Do you expect that the cost of abatement, or at least the cost of technology used for abatement, will be coming down, and then we'll get the private sector people to talk about what their experience is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would also say it's a debate that is raging, and as with most debates, there are ardent proponents on both sides. And I think that both sides of the debate are probably partially correct, as we heard from Martha about technologies that are going to be implemented, or that can be implemented, that are going to reduce the costs of abating or reducing our carbon emissions. So I think this is not only true in the energy sector, I think that's true everywhere. As we get better with technology, as we invest in technology, as we learn from technology, these technologies are going to get ever more efficient and less expensive. And I mean, I like the analogy of low-hanging fruit, and as we talked about in the past, I also like the analogy of the peanut butter jar. And the first scoop of peanut butter is really easy to get out of the jar. And the last scoop of peanut butter is the most difficult to get out of the jar. And I think that that's a countervailing force in the cost of abating carbon, is that, well, perhaps we have some really inexpensive, straightforward carbon abatement projects, ideas, technologies that we can use, and those might be really inexpensive. And that might be what we're realizing now when we look at the numbers that come out of this report. But what if the last little bit of peanut butter, or the last peaches on the top of the tree, what if they're really difficult to get? What if we need to come up with technologies that are extremely expensive? And for the purposes of the report, we're forecasting 10 years into the future. And so we made, and I'll tell you why we made the decision in a second, but we made the decision that it's probably going to be that some of the technologies are going to get cheaper, and so that's going to drive costs down. But some of the opportunities are going to be more difficult, so that's going to drive costs up. So we made the assumption that technology costs are not going to meaningfully change over the next 10 years. And if you think about it, really, we only have 9 years and a bit left before we get to 2030. And just as good empiricists, we also took a look at the past 15 or 20 years of data that we had on actual carbon abatement projects across a number of sectors, and we didn't find a trend. And so in the past, there didn't look like there was a trend, overall trend. There were some trends in some subsectors. And so we thought, you know what, that's probably a pretty good assumption for the next 9 years, particularly when we have a model in our mind that, well, they could go this way or they could go this way, and we're not sure which one of these two forces is going to be the strongest. So for the report, we thought the most prudent and most likely assumption would be costs aren't going to meaningfully change. Of course, they might not be $168 per ton to abate. It might be 165 or 172, but we're not talking about an order of magnitude difference. Just one last thing. In the report, we also we added ranges. So it wasn't just 12.8 billion. We said, well, it could be anywhere between 9 and 16 billion. So if you think that costs are going to come down or we're overestimating it, you can sort of orient yourself closer to the lower end of the range or to the higher end of the range. I think the 12.8 is a pretty good middle of the road likely assumption based on what we've done.
Very good. Carlyle, so in terms of the technology that you bring to bear in your various projects, do you see a trend? Do you see improvements in cost efficiencies? What's your experience?
Yeah, I think as you look at it on a project by project basis, there is for a project to get maximum scale and maximum opportunity, there is definitely an optimization. So yeah, the last 10% is generally the most expensive 10%, and I think, you know, as we were talking about before, you know, in putting heavy infrastructure in place, you know, it lasts for a long time, and that's where, you know, as we talked before about the infrastructure bank, or it's mentioned in the report, the infrastructure bank and other areas that can be very helpful in getting over that last little hump. I think that's really important. But as we talk about scale, we talk about technologies. I want to make sure that we also focus on just creating business models, which is really, really important. And then scale comes from creating the supply chain and managing the supply chain, like Martha talked about before. As you can manage and leverage your supply chain and create value up and down, you get value in business models just generally, and you know, it does make it a lot more quicker and easier to adapt as you continue to go forward. But there's definitely that peanut jar analogy. It does definitely resonate with many of us as one of the challenges to doing the projects.
Martha, what's the experience in the oil and gas sector, and particularly as we're starting to see one area where I know the industry is very focused, and Suncor among them, is digitalization, advanced materials, all these things that are really coming into the supply chain really in the last decade that are changing things for the better, one hopes.
Well, there's an awful lot going on in those areas, AI included. I mean, we do some of that here. There's a double benefit to that, because one, it allows us to be it helps reduce overall costs. as well. So it's not just focused on environmental performance or greenhouse gas emission reductions, but business performance as well. So that's been going on long before, you know, people were really understanding the importance of reducing GHGs. But clearly there's a double benefit there. One of the things to tie into what Ryan was talking about, and I guess really the whole discussion is yes, the peaches at the top of the tree or the peanut butter in the bottom of the jar, both really good visuals, having grown up on an apple farm. That is, I think, true generally, but we can't forget the other point that was mentioned, and that is, as you get into these, the cost of some of these technologies are going to go way down. So if I look at one really, really important example for not just, frankly, the oil sands, but all sort of large emitting, it's cement, steel, there is carbon capture and storage, carbon capture use and storage. And there's a big plant, a CCUS plant that was set up out here, referred to as the Quest project. It's been running. It's been working, and it's been reducing, greenhouse gas emissions. It's very interesting. What's also very interesting about it, well, one, perhaps less interesting, but it wouldn't have been built without massive government support, both federally and provincially. But hey, that's working, and it's reducing GHGs. But the numbers that they're finding, both from the capital costs, if you transpose those into potential new similar builds, are looking very positive. Their operating costs are looking very positive. They're even surprising those who built the plant in the first place. So, you know, here we have an example of something that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It is showing to be dropping in cost. The more learnings there are, the more people understand the technology. And then when you start extrapolating into, okay, what does scale look like? If you do a number of these, the costs then are going to be that much lower. It's pretty interesting in terms of what it is in terms per ton of GHG emission reduction. So that's a positive example. I just wanted to raise that as being, hey, we actually invest in some of these technologies and we start using them, kind of go back to that customer piece I mentioned before. The opportunities to find economies of scale and operating cost reductions are pretty interesting.
Shawn, can I jump in there just for 1 second? I think that's an interesting point, and one that I didn't have enough time to highlight. One of the things, and it's completely consistent with what you're saying, Martha, is that we don't actually have a lot of data. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity, even in this report. We got everything we could, right? We looked for every single publicly available academic or industry report that reports abatement in tons of CO2 and actual costs. And so we didn't make these numbers out of thin air. But I was surprised at how little data there was and how few projects have actually been implemented at scale and then reported on. There might be more projects out there. And so what I think we really need to do as a group, as a country, as an industry, is to engage in more of these projects. And so that we're not, it's great to be surprised on the positive side, right? But we need to get this information out there. We need to surprise ourselves on the positive side. So we need to mobilize capital. And then we need to report this to other people, particularly, I mean, I'm a researcher, I guess I'm a little bit biased, but it would be nice to get more of this information out there so we know how much it's actually going to cost. I don't want to say shocked, but I guess I was shocked at how much we've talked about tackling climate change and how little we know about how much it's going to cost. It's not just in Canada, it's everywhere. We really, saying that this is a blueprint and, other people have this under control. No one really has priced this stuff out. So we need more information on, well, what's carbon capture and storage going to cost? How can we bring this to scale? Where can we roll this out? And I'd love to be, I think everyone love to be surprised on the positive side. And now that we have, maybe this is a bad estimate, I think it's a good estimate that we come up with, but the more data we throw at this, the closer we're going to get, the closer we get to knowing what it's actually going to cost, the easier it is to finance, the easier it is to get built.
We're going to turn to questions from the audience. We've been soliciting questions from the audience, and so I'm going to pose the first one. And I'll probably start with one of you, but I want you all to feel free to jump in on this big one. And the first one I'm going to ask is, I picked it because that was my next question. So it's doing double duty here. And that is the role of government. And the role of government in setting policy that will, to the point of, what's driving investment. I mean, sometimes what drives investment isn't a wonderful investment opportunity. It's a requirement to meet policy, regulation. And so government plays that role, but government is also playing partnership role. So where, in your view, is the most important role for government to play? And I'm going to start with Craig, and then we'll, as I say, feel free to jump in after that, and we'll pick on a couple of you.
So I'll start by saying, and I'll be picking up on something that Martha said earlier, is in the area of procurement, being first buyer of technologies. Governments wield significant procurement leverage, and they can be the first buyer of key technologies. So they have a key role to play. They have the spending power, the investment power. That's an easy one. But they should be targeting that in the area of greatest wins and where they can be playing a nudging role. And then of course the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We're looking, partnerships, building partnerships. We need to get away from the thinking, and that's a key theme in this report, that government should be paying for this. They need to catalyze the investments, but then let the private sector step in and do our thing. So I guess those would be the three. I'll let others speak to regulation, etc.
Anybody want to jump in?
I would just, I won't take up too much of the time, but I would say that one of the important, I agree, Craig, those are all important things. But I think one thing that's extremely important is policy certainty. We need to have policy certainty with respect to the environment across jurisdictions, across governments, across elections. There's infinite, I want to say infinite, there's a ton of research on policy uncertainty negatively affecting investment at a firm level. Firms are not going to invest if they think next year their investment is essentially going to be regulated away. And so without that, it's going to be really difficult to find sort of groups of firms that need to invest and invest in projects that might be paying off 15 years from now if they're worried that next year some policy is going to come and erase sort of all of their gains. And I think, just to hammer home that one point, catalyzing investments. So being that first dollar in, or taking the first loss portion of a project, is extremely important to catalyze the investments that we need.
So just Martha, go ahead.
Ryan, that could be a long conversation. Before joining Suncor, I was running a public policy think tank, and regulatory and policy certainty was probably our biggest issue. And that doesn't matter what political party you're with. We're very publicly saying, we had some issues with the new Impact Assessment Act, but for gosh sakes, if and when the government ever changes, don't throw it out. Like, take what's good about what we have and improve things, but don't, we've had so much flip-flopping in the last decade in Canada, whether it's, Northern Gateway being turned off almost with a switch, our judicial involvement, which is hugely important, but TMX taking so long. Those are things we have to do, but once we get to that level of certainty, for gosh sakes, don't let's lose it, right? But I think, Shawn, there's obviously a financial role for government to play. I mentioned CCUS. CCUS does not generate revenue for companies like ours, but there are benefits potential if we use credits appropriately. We're able to use carbon credits more effectively across the country and globally. That's a whole other issue. But we also need a government to recognize just where those peaches are. Where is the low-hanging fruit? And there's no question we have a bit of a frustration with an anti-fossil fuel bias. But oil sands companies, oil and gas, we are the epitome of low-hanging fruit. We could just shut it all down, and that would, eliminate all of our emissions, but that would be economic suicide for Canada. So if we're not going to shut it down, how do we take advantage of that low-hanging fruit? we have to get away from the idea that, oh my gosh, fossil fuels bad. Well, for as long as Canadians and globally there is demand for what we produce, we want to produce it. We should be producing it, but we need to produce it as cleanly as possible. There is huge opportunity for government private sector collaboration there, but we have to get over this sort of bias of, oh well, they're big emitters, but we don't want to work with them because it's fossil fuels. That to me is really short-sighted for this country in particular as a major energy producer.
I would just throw in there that we besides getting oil and gas right, we also need to get transportation right. I mean, transportation is in terms of the amount of capital we need to mobilize, it's based on the report, twice what we're going to need in oil and gas. And so, while that's certainly important, we also have to think about how are we going to get people, goods, and services across the country. And this is a problem, let's just say we want to take a time machine, but this is a problem we have to solve in 2150. And 100 years, 200 years, we're still going to be a big country. And we're still going to have to get stuff across it. So that's, I think, another area where the role of the federal and provincial and municipal governments is important into, how are we going to get people and things across the country with whatever energy mix we end up coming up with.
But and the private sector too, Ryan. So, a lot of the transportation greenhouse gases are related to the stuff we sell, right? That people buy, right? We sell it, people buy it, people use it. Canadians use a lot of it. But for us, when we have the opportunity, for example, the Petro-Canada Electric Highway, using our stations, you could drive an electric car across the entire country. That's pretty awesome. Providing customers those opportunities, because people will say, yeah, I'd love to drive an EV, but I can't because it won't get me far enough. We take that really seriously at Suncor. It's not because, oh gosh, we just wanted people to buy our product. We're actively looking at how do we allow our customers to make those important choices so that they can help reduce the transportation piece.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think this has been a great conversation, and we could talk all afternoon about it. And I know lots of areas to dig deeper, but I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Shawn. The time did go by so quickly. Thanks to all of you for engaging online with us today for this very insightful and it was becoming very robust discussion on how we can advance the low carbon transition. I feel like it's sad to cut the conversation here, but there's nothing better than great analogies to put into perspective, whether it's peaches or peanut butter. As we've heard here today, transition to low carbon is most definitely not without its tensions and its challenges. And the Canadian Club of Toronto is pleased to have been joined by this impressive panel of experts and leaders to engage on this very issue. In closing, in summary, just to quote Martha, finding areas for collaboration, aiming for cooperation will be key towards finding that balance to this significant challenge. So we should keep that in mind as we move forward. Thank you again to Queen's University for their generous support in sponsoring today's event and allowing free access for everyone. We hope that all of you will join us for some of our upcoming events. Tomorrow, October 1st, we'll be joined by Jillian Riley of Tangerine Bank and Sabrina Jeremiah of Google Canada for a discussion on setting women entrepreneurs up for success. Next Thursday, October 8th, we're hosting Bert Clark, President and CEO of the Investment Management Corporation of Ontario. We hope that you'll all join us. Thanks again to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and LiveMeeting.ca for making it possible for us to come together virtually today. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and please stay healthy and safe. Till next time.